Welcome to my July webinar. It's great to have everyone here and to be talking about our subject tonight, which is attending to the head, heart, and gut, three levels in the physiology that are associated with feeling and thinking, and which help me to, awareness of them helps me to prescribe various approaches. And I thought I should address that because I think it's been a bit of a mystery to folks. And as a result, people don't always use some of the self-help techniques that I've tried to show over the last few years. So I was hoping that maybe by spending some time on it tonight, we could make people more self-sufficient and also better able to utilize my services when they call upon me for help. In the course of healing, especially from chronic serious illness, we have to deal not only with the physical manifestations of the disease, but with the energies related to our thinking, feeling, and karma, the underlying energies. Those energies produce the disease, and if not attended to, may make healing impossible. And often with the more serious illnesses, that the need to attend to the subtle energies becomes greater. There's a tendency to consider illness a bodily thing. It's clearly affecting our body. And thus to treat the illness only on the physical level. However, I think all of you who are attending this, and hopefully the people who may watch it in the future, have some sense that there's more to illness than just the physical disease. Now, of course, a physical illness may benefit from physical approaches to healing, and often surgical approaches. And often treating a life-threatening disease on the physical level gives us time to explore the underlying energies or to produce transformations based on shifting those subtle energies. Those energies, I made a note to myself that they're not always readily accessible. It's not that they're not accessible so much as that they may not be changeable that readily. It can be difficult, and indeed, in certain circumstances, may be impossible. But if we're going to have any hope of producing wellness, then we need to shift those energies. And in my practice, we attend to every level, to the body, primarily through diet, exercise, rest, stress management, purification. The mind, dealing with our beliefs and attitudes, feelings that are mainly heart, in the chest, we feel them, and in the gut. And with our overall sense of self, our consciousness, our sense of self-sufficiency, presence, well-being, all of those different words for pretty much the same thing, to describe a level of our existence, a subtle level of our existence, subtlest level of our existence, where disturbances may be difficult to perceive, but are extremely important to deal with if we're going to heal from a serious illness. So in this webinar, I'm going to explore the nature of the energies that are associated with the head, the heart, the gut. You know, we talk about gut feelings, and with the self, and relate that, of course, to our karma and how we'd have to deal with all of these as manifestations of our karma. Let's talk about the head first. We'll just work our way down. the head is primarily about thinking and worries. We know that we're in trouble when we find ourselves thinking about something and thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And it doesn't seem to be changing. It doesn't seem to be going away. It doesn't seem to be improving in any way. And yet we keep thinking about it and we keep analyzing it and looking at it from different perspectives, perhaps, but it doesn't change. So that kind of overthinking, obsessing, being critical, particularly self-critical, being judgmental or stuck, feeling helpless and unhappy, and or believing that we should be unhappy. Um, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, kind of energy that we're talking about in terms of how we experience it when we're talking about the head. And now, when I work on people, I don't really think about, oh, gee, we're working on the energy in the head. I'll go to the head if that's where my attention goes. But I'll be aware that a person is mainly overthinking a problem or situation in their life and may hold a belief that they should be suffering because of this, that, or the other thing. And, maybe they have some big responsibility, some job related thing that they have to do. And they're all uptight and worried about it and stressed out about it. And sometimes just asking the question and the approach, I was going to talk about the approaches to use in each of these things. So one of the approaches for the heads kind of stuff is what's known as the option method. And it's a really delightful technique. It's based on 4 very simple questions. The first is to identify what, I'm going to put it in first person because you do this to yourself. What am I unhappy about? What am I unhappy about? And usually you come up with something and it's fairly superficial. And then you say, and what is it about that bothers me? That's just an extension of that first question. It's digging deeper into the nature of what it is that's bugging me. And those 2 questions are just, it's like putting a brake on whatever the process is that's going on in the head and getting one to start thinking in terms of what is it that I'm actually responding to. Barry Kaufman tells a wonderful story. He's a psychologist, I believe. Tells a wonderful story. There was a family gathering, and I think they were in Arizona, New Mexico, some such place. And they wanted grandma to attend, and grandma attended, but she came, I think she took the railroad train. So she came by train, and family was together for a few days, and then some bad weather was coming, and they thought it would be good to get grandma home before the bad weather came. And I'm just trying to remember the story and it's in all the detail because it's such a cute story. So Barry came up with the idea to suggest that grandma fly home. But everybody in the family knew that grandma never takes an airplane. So Barry, in the family group, everybody's sort of there. And Barry says, Grandma, why don't we fly you back? Oh, because we could have you out this afternoon and you'd be home this evening and we'd be safe from the bad weather. And Grandma says, oh, I can't fly. I can't fly. And so here comes that refining question. She says, what am I unhappy about? It's about the thought of flying. What is it about that bothers you, Grandma? And Grandma says, well, I'm afraid the plane will crash and I'll die. Now, most people would just accept, okay, that's the end of it if she's afraid of dying in a plane crash. But Barry was very clever and he realized that wasn't really what it was that was compelling grandma to not fly. And so he asked the question again, well, what is it about flying in an airplane and having it crash and you're dying that bothers you? Now, you see what a strange question that is when in that context? And so if you ask that question of yourself, it does something to your brain. It like shakes you. It's like physically shaking you. And it goes like, oh, come on, what is it? What is it really about that bothers you? And so he asks the question, and Grandma says, well, I'm afraid that when the plane crashes, I'll be thrown from the airplane, and the rescue people won't be able to find my body. Well, that's a completely unexpected answer. So Barry says, oh, so what is it about the plane crashing and you're dying and your body being thrown from the airplane and the rescuers not being able to find it right away that bothers you? And you see, we're already in some pretty far out territory here. And Grandma thinks for a moment. She says, well, I'm afraid that wild animals will eat me. You think, well, okay, that should be the end of the story. But Barry asks the question yet again. What is it about your being thrown from the airplane when the plane crashes and you die and you're thrown from the airplane and the rescuers can't find your body and wild animals eat your body? And she ponders for a moment because she really had never thought of it. And she says, well, I'm afraid I'd be unacceptable to God. And then Barry finally accepts that as the end point of the story. And he says, Grandma, you've been a religious person all your life. You pray to God, you follow the commandments. What is it about the animals? He goes through the whole story again. He repeats everything because that keeps the thread connected. And he says, when he gets to, and the wild animals will eat you and you'd be unacceptable. You think you'd be unacceptable to God. What makes you think that God cares what happens to your body? And Grandma realizes that she's held this belief actually, it's a whole series of beliefs. She's held these beliefs her whole life, and they're baseless. She has no reason to believe that God would find her unacceptable because she's lived a good life. And so she got on the airplane and went home. So that's a long story to illustrate the option method. It's not one I use a lot, although I use that question, what is it about that really bothers you? I use that question a great deal. People say, oh, I'm so frightened about, taking some test. And you say, what is it about taking that test that bothers you? Well, obviously the answer is, well, I'm afraid I'll fail the test. So now comes the obvious question. Now it becomes an obvious question. It wasn't an obvious question before I started all of this. Now it's an obvious question. Well, what is it about taking this test and failing it that bothers you? What are the consequences of that? And so we answer a question, which is question number 2. Why am I unhappy about that? Now, I don't like a why question myself because it tends to get us into a story. And the story may be just a story, very superficial, not really helping us get deep into a situation. But we're trying to answer the question, why am I unhappy about that? And the reason is that we have beliefs about the situation, and we need to find out whether those beliefs are really true. And one of the ways we find out if the beliefs are really true is to ask the third question, what would it mean if I were not unhappy about that? What would it mean if I were not unhappy about that? What would it mean if I were not unhappy about the possibility of failing the exam? And the usual first answer that we get is, Well, it would mean that I don't really care about my future, that I'm irresponsible, and some other negative things. And then we ask that question again. But we can ask it like this: is it true that it means that if I were not happy about that, that I didn't care and care about whatever it is we're talking about, whatever the example is or situation is? Is it true? So we call it into question, and we can ask, would it mean that? Or we could say, why do I believe that being unhappy would be bad for me right now? Which takes us back to that. What is it about that that really bothers me? Because we're trying to get to the what is it that I believe about the situation, that I believe that being happy would be bad for me, that I must be unhappy. Because we must have some belief about that, or we wouldn't stay unhappy. But we hold on to our unhappiness. And that's that whole point about this, the relationship of this to the head thinking experience, is that we tend to be ruminating on a problem, thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. It's not getting better. And it's the fundamental reason is it's because something in us believes that we need to be unhappy in order to be okay, that being unhappy is better for us than being happy. And so there's this belief that's in the way, and we need to confront that and see whether it's really true. And so kind of a fifth question at the end is that true? Is that belief true? Is it true that if we were not unhappy, that we wouldn't care and we wouldn't really try? Because when we are afraid that we're not going to pass the test, we study really hard. We work really hard at it, although it may get in the way. That fear may get in the way and make it actually hard for us to study and absorb material. So when the head stuff gets in the way, the option method is a really good way to do it. It may take some help from me the first couple of times you try to do this. You can try doing it, though, with the 4 questions. What am I unhappy about? And what is it about that that bothers me? And keep asking that question, because if you keep asking that question, you eventually get to an endpoint where you can say, why am I unhappy about that? Is it true that I have to be unhappy? And if you find out it isn't true, then you can just let it go. In fact, you usually find out it isn't true. Okay, I've spent a lot of time in that first example, but I think it's an interesting one, and one that I haven't been talking about very much. And of course, you can always use the emotional freedom technique. We abbreviate that usually EFT, emotional freedom technique, the tapping technique. And I've shown us how to do that any number of times. And that's very good for turning around our feelings. It's just absolutely amazing, particularly when you get used to doing it. It often works just very, very quickly, once or twice around in the tapping sequence with the affirmations that we say, even though I have this paper to write and I'm afraid that I can't do it well, even though I have this paper to write and I'm terribly afraid that I can't do it well, I know I'm perfectly capable of researching the topic and writing a good paper. I fully believe in myself. Yeah, that's showing like that. And that's just a nice little example of the faster EFT, emotional freedom technique. Okay. Let me move on to the heart. I need to move this along here. Heart is emotional pain, heartache, grieving, and other strong negative feelings. And the prescription that I like a lot is the emotional freedom technique, the tapping, and the inner relationship focusing. Inner relationship focusing. And focusing is that wonderful technique where you say, use a sentence, and it's very good to use the sentence. Something inside me feels, or in this case, you could say something inside me aches with grief, to give an example here. Something inside me aches with grief, and I'm here with that. And then you can go on. I ask that ache how it wants me to be with it. Now, that's a very special sentence. You may want to put that down. I ask whatever the feeling is. I'm using ache here, heartache, as grief. I ask that ache how it wants me to be with it. That language is very specific. I suggest using precisely that language. I ask that, whatever the feeling is, how it wants me to be with it. You don't have to do it every time. It's not always necessary. But a lot of times when you're with something like heartache, it tends to just sit there. And it doesn't give you much other than its pain. And so when you ask it how it wants you to be with it, you're basically saying, I, the self in presence, they call it, which is the sense of self, which is the witness of experience, says, and this is on the material level of life, if you will. It asks it what it needs without saying, what do you need? Because if you ask it what it needs, it isn't going to tell you. But when you ask it how it wants you to be with it, it's one of those questions that kind of like, oh, well, I just want you to sit with me. Okay, I'll sit with you. And so you could say something like, I'm sitting with it silently, or sitting with you. You can speak right to it, holding that inner space that we shared for so long in the case of grieving for some loss of someone, right? Holding that tender space that we shared for so long. You can insert any phrase you want there, just depending on the situation. But that gives you an idea how we can deal with a really deep emotional pain. And again, may need some of my help initially getting into it. But once you've got it, you can often do this on your own. And you may have to do it again and again because there's myriad different aspects of the pain that are going to come out. And so you have to deal with them as they come up. On the gut level, conflict, big one, conflict, danger and fear or anxiety related to conflict, stress, danger, like that kind of fear. A very good technique here and a different one than I've mentioned before, Ho'oponopono. It's a Hawaiian technique. It is really an energy technique, although it sounds like it works on the superficial level. But again, 4 questions. It's again like in a relationship focus. Pardon me, like option method. There are 4 questions, and you can say like this: I'm sorry about this conflict we've gotten ourselves into. You don't have to say it to the person. You can just say it sitting quietly. I'm sorry about this, whatever the situation is we've gotten ourselves into. Please forgive me for my opposition if we're talking about conflict. I'm sorry, please forgive me. I love you unconditionally and respect your individuality or your uniqueness or your point of view or whatever. And then finally, I'm grateful for all you've contributed to our relationship. I am grateful. So the 4 key points are, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you. It's implied that that means unconditionally. And I'm grateful. Okay, those are the 4 key points if you're making notes. And I think what else? I think that's all I need to say about that. Ho'oponopono is extremely effective. Again, it's basically an energy technique, and I guess that gives me an opportunity to say that all of these things are dealing with energies within our body, and the work that I do with people's energies is always interactive, even when I'm doing something that sounds like that's on the low level of the intellect, like the option method. What I'm doing is sensing into those energies and seeing how they might be transformed. And finally, and of course, with gut stuff, you can also use focusing and EFT, because these are where a lot of the just general feelings are hanging out. Very good for stress. Very good for stress. Oftentimes the feelings are very vague. You can't really immediately identify them. And so focusing is good because you say something inside me feels, and you just describe it. It feels unpleasant. That's about as vague as you can get. And then you can kind of go, well, what is it about that unpleasantness that's really striking? And then you get into a little more, well, it's a sour kind of taste feeling. Okay, it's a sour taste feeling. So you say it back to it. And just keep going on, getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the feeling. Let's talk about spiritual stress for the moment. These are existential threats or threats to one's identity, affecting our sense of self. Life-threatening illness, for instance, or injury, whatever's life-threatening, can be very, very challenging as a spiritual stress. And that stress may then turn up in physical symptoms in the body. Threatened or actual loss of a job or a relationship is another kind of stress that really gets our sense of self. And so for these kinds of things, there's a whole series of things that one can do. And you can certainly deal with the feelings that are related to that. But to really get at the root cause, of course, our practice of transcendental meditation, and possibly some other forms of meditation. Yagya, which are Vedic performances to transform the trends of time. And yagya may be the thing to really save us at a time of spiritual stress where we're just kind of falling apart. Things are not going well. We don't seem to have control over our lives. Not that we ever actually have control over our lives, but at least on that superficial level where we feel threatened by a lack of a sense of where we have some efficacy in our lives. I think often of refugees in being in that kind of a situation. I don't know how people do it as a refugee. I've been unable to understand how people can have the fortitude to keep it together when they literally don't know where their next meal is coming from or when the next bomb is going to fall. But anyway, yoga can be a powerful transformative approach. And then there's things that you can do, community service, for instance, giving away things, tithing, charity, giving charity, can have a powerful effect on our karma. So, but we can deal with some of the emotional stuff with some of the other techniques that I listed earlier. All right, that about covers it. So how to create a practical program for healing, hopefully that you can implement yourself, perhaps with some help from me if needed. And you want to start out by identifying the type of problem confronting you. Is it a head problem, a heart sort of problem, a gut problem, or spirit problem? And if you can, Let nature and your body tell you what type of problem you have rather than trying to figure it out by reasoning or thinking about it. If you can, get that deeper sense of it, feel it in your body rather than try to logically process it in your head. Part of that is changing your perspective on it instead of being caught up. Well, the nature of the problem is that my digestion is very poor. That's a medical diagnosis. That's not an analysis of the energies and where they're located. Sure, there's something going on in the intestines, but is it really a gut thing or is it maybe a heart thing? And of course, some things are a combination. We have to understand that. It's important to distinguish the category of a problem from the medical classification of the symptoms of the problem. Fear likely involves the gut, but check on your body to see if it is, because it may be in the heart or maybe both. And if it is, then focusing may be the best approach because it'll take you to where the inner energies are located. If it is, focusing may be the best approach, and you can use EFT, emotional freedom technique, and Ho'oponopono as needed. And of course, you can call on me so you really get the help that's needed. I have an example here of emotional stress that illustrates how you could be affected in more than one area. First of all, you may be with an emotional stress. You may be thinking about it too much and you may have heartache and abdominal discomfort. You may also feel less yourself in this situation. That's the fourth category, spiritual one. Pick the area that comes first into your awareness, whatever comes to you first or strongest, and use whichever technique seems appropriate. It's important to remember that there's no wrong approach. It's not like you would make a mistake if you pick, say, focusing over emotional freedom technique. That's not going to get you into trouble. It's just whatever's going to work to move things along. Okay. I think that gives you a picture of how I develop a program for people while I'm working with you individually. I'm not stopping to pick it out. Kind of the way I laid it out here is a schema. My attention just goes to a particular area and I use whatever technique just comes to me at that time as to be what I then feel is the best way to get at it, to get help with that area. And sometimes I switch or even combine techniques a little bit. I particularly like that question. What is it about that really bothers you? That's one of my favoriteest questions. So hope you made a note of that and we'll try using it. And again, if you need to get some instruction in how to do any of these procedures, feel free to contact me. You can do so through my website, or you can send an email to dsands, SANDS, D as in David, Sands at partnershipforwellbeing.com. That's my email address, dsands at partnershipforwellbeing.com. Okay, I'll stop here, see if there are any questions. And if not, draw this presentation to a conclusion. We'll move on in a moment to our group clearing session where we'll actually use whatever techniques are necessary to clear out the energies underlying things that may be on the physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual levels affecting our well-being.